All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name's Jen. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. And thank you so much for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn Silent Presence, the French in New England. Our presenter today is independent scholar Jeanne Douillard. Her passion for the history of the French in the Americas led her to delve deeply into the quagmire of conflicting historiographies. English, French, and American historians of the past offered up irreconcilable views of New France and its people, and she has been intrigued by that for the last 25 years. So Jeanne has authored I Remember, Jean-Mi Sauvens. I apologize for my French. Jeanne is also one of the major contributors to the book Building a Better Life, The French Canadians in Western Massachusetts, published by the Republican newspaper in Springfield, Massachusetts. And Jeanne also contributed the narrative poem Not So Much the Same Place to Heliotrope French Heritage Women Create, an anthology of women writers of French heritage. And today, Jeanne will address why she believes the French have had such a silent presence in New England. So welcome, Jeanne. I'm going to let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I thank the Connecticut Museum for hosting this presentation today. This is from former Massachusetts Senator F.K. Foster. The French Canadians are ignorant, immoral, much worse than the Chinese of California, and a blight on society. Bonjour. Good afternoon. J'ai une histoire à vous raconter. I have a story to tell you. The possibility of reinventing oneself, of leaving everything behind and moving into a future that has no past, has been compelling for many who immigrated to the United States. On the other hand, I believe passionately that our individual and cultural narratives are essential for us all. In fact, I believe their loss is detrimental to our well-being as a nation. How can we be asked to respect those of different cultures if we don't even know and embrace our own story? Today, I'll be interspersing my personal memories as a Franco-American growing up in New England alongside the history of the French in the Americas. As Jennifer Lee, a Native American storyteller, says, to know what happened can empower and inform you. This is from Dr. Yves Roby in his book, The Franco-Americans in New England. Worse yet, they had interiorized the negative image that the Americans and even their own elite attributed to them. Indeed, educated people keep telling us the English have told us we are dumb, and we believed it. We keep repeating it at home, in the street. We have really gotten the idea the Francos will never set the world on fire. Growing up, I felt deeply the challenges of being French in New England. I was shaped by a people whose self-perception was founded on weakness, not strength, burdened by feelings of inferiority and unspoken rage. I felt shame. There was so much I did not understand. So I'm going to admit that what I've just shared with you is not easy for me to say in public. I always thought I was the only one who had feelings and experiences such as these. But by trusting that what I experienced was real, I have discovered a very important and interesting story, which I'm very happy to share with you today. So let's begin with my ancestral roots. I'm an American with ancestral roots in France, Quebec, Old Acadie, the Algonquin Nation, and England. I always tell people that all the warring factions circulate in my blood. I was the oldest child born in Western Massachusetts, and French was my first language until I began school at the age of 5. At an early age, I came to understand the French I spoke was derided in some quarters, and I didn't know why. In the late 1970s, I moved from New Hampshire to Denver, Colorado. While there, I had two experiences that, unbeknownst to me at the time, would shape the future direction of my life. First, I observed how the Mexicans were treated in Colorado with disdain and disrespect. And I remember thinking to myself, this feels very familiar. It reminds me of attitudes I've experienced and encountered as a Franco-American growing up in New England. And the second thing, while in Denver, when some people found out I could speak French, they were really impressed. And this shocked me. And I began to rethink my whole attitude toward my language and my culture, even though I can't tell you that I thought about this at the time. It's only in looking back that I realized that. So, the French language issue, what is that about? And maybe if some of you grew up in New England, you might remember this. Through the years, when I've told people in New England that I speak French, I've often been asked, do you speak French Canadian or do you speak Canuck? Why are these questions asked? Well, I discovered that in 20th century America, so-called Parisian French became the standard for educated classes in the United States. And Acadien, Canadien pronunciations were derided as just rural French or not real French. Well, I'm here to tell you there's no such language as French Canadian or Canuck. I speak French. Yes, I can speak French with the pronunciation I learned from my Quebecoise Acadienne grandmother and my bilingual mother. And yes, it does sound different than the French spoken in other parts of the world. It is nevertheless real French. So what's the story here? Why did this happen? Well, in Acadie and Canada, without the influence of radio or television, the French pronunciations and the old French words of the 1600s were retained in their small, isolated villages. The 1600s French is what our people brought here to New England in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's this French they taught their children and grandchildren. It's real French, the French of Molière, Rousseau, and King Louis XIV. No need for apology anymore. Since we're literally going to be taking a speed train through history, I thought it might be useful to offer this timeline as an aid. We'll revisit this slide throughout the first part of our talk. So, contrasting the history of Old World England to that of Old World France is notable, for these two countries were very important players in the history of 1600s North America. I hope these facts help, for they do set the stage for the political climate and the attitudes that became established later on. In 1215, the Magna Carta was signed. Over time, this document did three things. It helped curb the power of the English monarchy, a parliament was formed, and representative government eventually became the norm. This system was well established in the 1600s by the time of colonization in the Americas. Come on. I'm running into a problem with my, sorry, I can't figure out what's happening. I'm going to change my slide for just a second. I can't get to the next one. Let's try here. I apologize for that. Okay, here we are. So we're going to take a brief look at Old World France around this time period. Between 1598 and 1643, three men laid the foundations for the absolutist monarchy that was to reach its peak under King Louis XVI in France. This is the time, of course, of the immigration to the Americas. No limits like the Magna Carta in England were imposed. At the same time, France still retained elements of the old feudal system. Thus, unlike the English colonists of the 1600s, French colonists had no experience in representative governance. In this segment, we're going to give a bit of historical background on the three groups of people found in Northeast America in the 1600s: the indigenous peoples, the English, and the French. We'll also explore briefly the motivations bringing Europeans to this land. The natives of the Northeast were individual nations linked by language, but each with their own unique social systems and customs. They weren't one people, one culture, living under the same rules, like we've been led to believe in our history classes. Along the North Atlantic coast, which is New England today, most indigenous groups had transitioned to farming and lived in villages. So when the English and French arrived on these shores, remember they were enemies from far, far back, they brought their international conflicts with them, and native nations, which were caught up in their own ongoing struggles, attempted to adjust to the European presence. The new political realities made for a very tumultuous period for them. And in addition, Europeans also introduced previously unknown diseases to this region, and 80 to 90% of the native peoples living along the East Coast died in the early years. Imagine that. Shocking. Not only were there very great differences between the English and the French styles of governance in Europe at the time of settlement, there was also a stark contrast in the way the English and French rulers viewed their role in the Americas. So for the English, early on, their claims were limited. Please note the brown section on the right-hand side. Their focus, however, was on colonization. And this is very important to note. For British monarchs remained engaged in this territory through the years. The rulers believed that control of the new land would be to their benefit and could result in commercial and economic domination. And as we know, this did come to pass. And the toll it took on native peoples living here was catastrophic. Now, contrary to the English kings, colonization was not a primary concern for the French monarchs. They were much more interested in accumulating wealth, primarily gold and silver, like the Spanish had. And when it became clear that these were not to be found in Northeast America, revenues were exacted from the lucrative fur trade. Colonization was not all that important to the French government, but by 1700 they had claimed a vast territory. I mean, all the territory in blue was claimed by France and called La Nouvelle France. However, the vastness of French territorial claims made it very difficult to govern, and as early as 1672, the energy of the French monarch turned to European domination and interest in the new colony flagged. Now, this date is very important. It's the only date I'm going to ask you to remember, and you'll be reminded anyway. We'll discover how this decision had repercussions on the lives of the French colonists, that is, my ancestors and all Franco-Americans in New England, living in the Americas by then. Although France claimed a great deal of territory, there were only two major French settlements in La Nouvelle France, Acadie and Canada. Now is the time for the more personal stories of our ancestors, the Acadiens and the Canadiens. We start off with the story of Acadie. The region shown on this map is what we now call the Maritime Provinces in Canada. In the 1600s, the indigenous peoples living here were the Abenaki, the Malecite, and the Mi'kmaq. They weren't settled in farming communities like to the south, but they were hunter-gatherers who changed location according to the seasons. Port-Royal, now called Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia, was founded in 1605. Since the Mi'kmaq lived in this particular area, they were essential in helping the French immigrants adjust to life in this cold, harsh land. They formed trading partnerships, and in the early years, intermarriage was not that uncommon. Unlike what happened to the South in New England, where competition for land between the English and the indigenous peoples caused serious problems for the natives, there was little competition for land between the native people and the French in Acadie. Here, I'm referring specifically to Nova Scotia. For the French immigrants settled marshy coastlands, areas not commonly used by the Mi'kmaq. Over the years, using a dike system that was very unique, the French immigrants worked hard to reclaim and develop this marshland into successful, productive farmland. It was a life of much hardship, but they also knew how to enjoy themselves. Faith and family meant everything to the new settlers. They gathered together often to play music, dance, tell stories, and laugh. These get-togethers gave them much joy. Now, since control of Acadie vacillated between the English and French over a period of many years, the French immigrants in Acadie lived without the constant oversight of the French government or of the Catholic Church, both of which operated out of Canada. And this is very significant. For over the years, these French immigrants in Acadie developed practices of rudimentary self-government, learning valuable lessons from the English, who were their trading partners and occasional overlords. And they also learned from their native neighbors and relatives, who had a very different approach to leadership. In the early years, these French settlers maneuvered through the minefields of French and British demands, using their innate wiliness to get what they wanted. They did this without violence or warfare. By the late 1600s, the territory known as Acadie had expanded and now included not only Nova Scotia, but also Ile Saint-Jean, which is now PEI, Ile Royale, which is Cape Breton Island, as well as New Brunswick and good part of northern Maine. So remember earlier in this talk I mentioned the date 1672? This was when the energy of the French government was being deflected away from Nouvelle-France toward Europe. And the following is one example of how this played out here in the Americas. In 1713, a part of French Acadie, which is specifically Nova Scotia today, was officially handed over to Britain by the French government. The rest of Acadie remained in French hands. So, as a consequence of this decision, the French government and the Catholic Church operating out of Canada wanted the French who were living in Nova Scotia to move to lands controlled by the French. But most people chose to stay in place, for after all, this had been their home for 100 years. Why take a chance with the unknown? And understandably, this did not endear them to the French and Catholic leaders in Canada, who demanded absolute obedience to their wishes. After 1713, the now British government in Nova Scotia allowed the Acadiens who remained there to elect men who would represent them in negotiations with British leaders. However, they also insisted the Acadiens take an oath of allegiance to the British king. Now you can imagine this was a serious dilemma for them. Conflicts between the French and the English in North America didn't end in 1713. And if the Acadiens took the oath, they'd be obliged to fight against their French cousins in Canada. What to do? Over time, their solution was to refuse to align politically with either of the two powers, England or France. But by choosing to remain neutral in a political environment that required taking sides, they would suffer serious consequences. They would find themselves alone in their hour of need. In the spring of 1755, the leader of Nova Scotia and the governor of Massachusetts determined that this land, Nova Scotia today, would now be only for the British. There were 7,000 Massachusetts troops already there, and in the fall of that year, in an event that became called Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Disturbance, thousands of Acadiens were violently removed from their homes. In the ensuing chaos, many family groups were separated. Not only were the people torn from their homes and from each other, but all they had worked for was destroyed. Their homes, their crops, their livestock, everything. Their native neighbors and friends tried to help, but neither the Canadiens nor the French soldiers from Canada came to their aid. They were left on their own against the powerful British who were intent on taking everything away from them. This, my friends, is ethnic cleansing at a time when the phrase did not even exist. The Acadiens were placed on cargo ships which had been refitted for human cargo, much like the vessels used in the slave trade. By the end of 1755, nearly 7,000 people were forcibly removed. Many were lost in storms encountered as they traveled south toward New England and beyond. On November 5th, 1755, 6 ships headed for ports along the Atlantic coast limped into Boston Harbor. Massachusetts authorities who boarded the ships found appalling conditions on board: overcrowding, illness, bad water, inadequate provisions. From Boston, the ships were sent down the eastern seaboard. No port city was alerted to their coming, and the exiles encountered fear and prejudice wherever they were deposited. Throughout these years, in addition to being exiles in British America and France or imprisoned in England, Acadiens found themselves dispersed all over the world, many in lands claimed by France. What a marked change of fortune for a people who had been so successful in Acadie. Was this to be the end of their story? Well, we're going to check in with them in a short while. It's now time to travel to Canada to tell the story of the Canadiens. And please note that when I refer to Canada in this section, I'm only speaking of the lands along the St. Lawrence River. Now, when the French arrived here, the primary indigenous group in that region that would come to be known as Canada was the Algonquin people. They too didn't live in farming communities and were semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers, changing location according to the seasons. Early on, it was easy for the Algonquin to establish trading relations with the French, since they wanted the European goods that made their lives easier, while the French wanted their furs. Things got more complicated and much more difficult for them later on. So in the beginning, fish and fur were the chief attractions of North America for the French. The first immigrants to Canada were mostly men, and many were involved in the lucrative fur trade, riding rivers all over northern America. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded La Ville de Québec, Quebec City. Since our French ancestors immigrated to Canada over 100 years before the French Revolution, there were elements of the feudal system that accompanied them to the Americas. Lands were arranged in long, narrow strips along the St. Lawrence River, which are the blue lines in both of those maps, and they were called seigneuries. These lands were called seigneuries. They were overseen by seigneurs, and the people who worked the land were called habitants. In this French colony, contrary to what we learned about Acadie, all power was vested in the monarchy, its representatives, and the Catholic Church. In addition, a strict class system like that found in France existed here in the early years. So, unlike in Acadie, the settlers in Canada didn't have the chance to learn about different approaches to governance, because I just told you, both the French government and the Catholic Church operated out of this region, and both had a very strong presence here. This is a very important distinction, for it's one of the things that sets the Canadian experience apart from that of the Acadiens in the Americas. However, there were similarities between the two groups. As in Acadie, faith and family meant everything to the new settlers. They worked hard in an unforgiving land and gathered together in large farm kitchens to play music, dance, tell stories, and laugh heartily. These soirees were a source of much joy. Now we're fast forwarding to the mid-1700s. I told you it was going to be a speed train. Times were beginning to change in Canada. The strict class system was dissolving. An air of independence was beginning to stir. Those born in Canada began to think of themselves not only as Français, but also Canadiens. And concomitantly, church, military, and government leaders were being chosen among the Canadiens and not assigned from France. The people actually began to believe they might be able to determine their own destiny. Unfortunately, this was short-lived. Here comes this date, 1672 again. We've already spoken about how this decision had impacted the Acadiens. Here's what happened in Canada. In 1759, 4 years after Le Grand Dérangement began in Acadie, the British decided to take possession of all northern lands. In this effort, they spared nothing. On the French side, it was too little, too late, and the French loss on the Battle of the Plains of Abraham ended French domination in the region. The French government's lack of financial support and laissez-faire attitude in the Americas had taken its final toll. The Treaty of Paris was a significant event in the Americas. The signing of this document had repercussions on the lives of both the Acadiens and the Canadiens. So with the signing of this treaty, France ceded all of its territories in North America. There are a few exceptions, very few, and they ceded them to Great Britain and Spain. La Nouvelle France was no more. So at the end of the section on the Acadiens, we asked this question: was this to be the end of their story? We find that although dispersed throughout the world, the Acadiens had not disappeared. We now pick up their tale once more. In 1763, with most northern territories now in British hands, Acadiens began going up to Canada. Some of their confrères had escaped there, and my family included, before and during the deportation. So there were already Acadiens living in the St. Lawrence River Valley, willing to help them settle here. Acadiens also returned to the maritime provinces, the lands of their ancestors. But this was a different story. Severe restrictions applied. They could only return in small family groups and were not allowed to go back to the lush farms their ancestors had worked so hard to develop. For these had now been taken over by British planters from New England. The Acadiens who returned were forced to settle the rocky coastlands. Why? Well, basically, the British were worried that if they came back and settled in large groups, they could rebel and try to retake their territory. And then there's Louisiana. This region had been under French control, but after the Treaty of Paris, was now in Spanish hands. The Acadiens were encouraged to come here by the Spanish government, and word spread very quickly throughout the community, all the communities all over the world. They settled west of New Orleans and shared the swamps, bayous, and prairies with local Native American tribes. They were also greatly influenced by African Creoles. And as many of you probably know, the Acadiens who went to Louisiana eventually became known as Cajuns. So how did the Treaty of Paris signing affect the Canadiens? I want to let you know that at this point, when we're speaking of Canada, we're speaking primarily of the region we now know of as Quebec and Ontario at this particular period of time. I remember attending a lecture on Canadian history in Springfield, Massachusetts in the 1990s, given by a historian with a British point of view, I have to admit. She implied the Canadiens never really had suffered under British rule in Canada. After all, there was no ethnic cleansing like that which had taken place in Acadie. But I contend that the Canadiens did suffer. How their suffering was more hidden, but no less impactful. Now, this section is complicated, the next one, so I'm going to give only a brief overview of what life was like for the Canadiens after the Treaty of Paris was signed. For the Canadiens, life continued to be lived under the control of both church and state, only now the state was English, not French. In these years, tension between English and French speakers was very high, for after all, the French were the overwhelming majority population in Canada at that time. Because of this, several concessions were made by the British government in 1774 and 1791. These decisions were arrived at primarily because the British were concerned the majority French-speaking population could rebel. And when the French Revolution began in France, during this period, British fears became only too real. If their French cousins in France were turning against their government and church, the Canadiens could turn against them. British leaders eventually realized they could use the considerable influence of the Catholic Church to keep those people down. That is, the troublesome Canadiens. And in the years around the French Revolution in France, they recruited French Catholic priests to Quebec. These were hardline conservatives who would work hard to be sure there would be no rebellion among the French population in this country. This, my friends, would have serious repercussions for the Canadiens in the years to come. What was the role of the Catholic Church? Well, I'm going to be intentionally vague because this portion of the history is just too complex to dissect in this talk, but I will be addressing that later on. This I can say. Although the power and influence of the Catholic Church leaders in Canada waxed and waned after the British victory, their influence remained very significant. In the years to come, this would have serious repercussions for them. So we now jump to the 1840s, 77 years after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and just prior to the time when immigration to the United States began in earnest. Here we ask, how were the Acadiens in the maritime provinces faring under British rule? Well, contrary to the period before Le Grand Dérangement, the Acadiens were now in a subservient position. According to Professor Mac Faragher in his book, A Great and Noble Scheme, the Acadians who had returned to the maritime region would long remain a subject population. The political conditions and depressed economic realities for the Acadiens in the maritime provinces would keep them oppressed and poor. And now we ask, how were the Canadiens faring under British rule? Suffice it to say, any time a group exercises power and control over another, tries to force them to conform to the power group's expectations, and in this story there are two groups, government and church, there is pain and suffering. Each time the Canadiens started to believe they might take control of their own lives, something happened to interrupt the process. Events kept church and state powerful, kept the Canadiens powerless. There were two major waves of immigration of French speakers to the north, from the north, to the south, especially New England. Between the mid-1800s and the end of the 19th century, and then again at the end of World War I, from 1920s to 1930s. 900,000 to 1 million French speakers from both Quebec and the Maritime provinces eventually left Canada for the United States. This from Dr. Yves Roby. The Americans viewed their Franco-American compatriots as docile, passive, and defeatist creatures, totally lacking in ambition. Although they settled in many different regions of this country, the Acadiens and Canadiens came primarily to New England because industrialization developed faster here than in Canada, and there were many jobs available. The Acadiens and Canadiens were known to be ideal candidates for the mills, for they were hard-working people, skilled and conscientious, but also pliable and not prone to question authority. Recruiters flocked to Canada to entice them to move here. Seemingly overnight, Catholic French speakers were a predominant ethnic presence in this small part of America. Someone once asked me during a talk, what makes the French-Canadian immigrant story different from other immigrant stories in New England? And I thought this was an incredibly wonderful question. I'd like to offer 3 points for our consideration. First, we must remember there was a long history of animosity between the English in New England and the French in Canada. Because of this history, the French speakers were already a known entity in New England, and they were not beloved. As a byproduct of the recruitment effort by mill owners in Canada, a severe social class conflict arose in New England between those who were encouraging immigration and those who felt that the immigrants posed a threat to what they perceived as their land. Sound familiar? With the influx of Acadiens and Canadiens, Catholics were also becoming a predominant group in Protestant New England. Long simmering fear and prejudice erupted to greet the latest arrivals. In the 1920s, a revised KKK, different from the Klan of the 19th century, primarily anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, and anti-alien, arrived. Klan leaders came to the Northeast, and people were recruited to join them in each of the New England states. This from Vermont author and historian Roland E. Robinson. They, that is the French Canadians, were an abominable group of vagabonds, robust and lazy men and boys, slatternly women with litters of filthy brats, and all as detestable as they are uninteresting. In the 1930s, forced sterilization was introduced into the state of Vermont. Those families living, and I quote, outside the accepted moral or social convention of middle-class America, like the Abenaki and French Canadians, were specifically targeted. Even under these difficult conditions, the Acadiens and Canadiens did not leave. It wasn't an easy transition for them, and here we take note of the other 2 points that made their immigration experience different from other immigrants to New England. For one thing, unlike many ethnic groups, they could easily travel back and forth to their homeland in the north. And this caused New Englanders to feel these immigrants were not really serious about settling here. Much was written about this, and it was not complimentary. Again, something familiar. The third point, the question of assimilation into this English-speaking Protestant region was also a very complicating factor. Before immigration to New England began in earnest, the elite in Canada had been fighting hard against the English push for assimilation in culture and language. Called la survivance, this struggle for survival had been intense. It was taken to New England, and assimilation was not encouraged by the leadership. In the next 3 slides, we're going to consider the perspective of 3 fairly well-known Franco-American authors who grew up in New England. This from retired Columbia University professor David Plante in his memoir, American Ghosts. Why should I feel anything but failure? Why should I feel a success in anything when, as a Canuck, it was foregone that I would not succeed? Expect nothing, I told myself. Expect nothing. This from Pulitzer Prize-winning author Annie Proulx, Franco-American author, in her book Bird Cloud. Her Franco father married a woman with Yankee roots. And what did it do to us growing up as outsiders, as part of no people except our mother's pale-eyed Yankee clan, who subtly gave us the sense that we were different and somehow tainted? And this from Franco-American author and poet Jack Kerouac. Because I cannot write my native language and have no native home anymore, and I'm amazed by that horrible homelessness of all French Canadians abroad in America. A Columbia University professor, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, a world-renowned writer, all expressing the same sentiment. Just imagine what has not been shared. So at this point, I'm going to give a brief sort of synopsis of this story. It's leading to something, I promise. Here's what happened. Our ancestors, my ancestors, came to North America over 100 years before the French Revolution. That event in France radically changed the country, and its people were eventually freed from a repressive past. They reclaimed their lives, their pride. But our people, our progeny, we were not there. They were struggling, our people were struggling with their own unique challenges here in the Americas, many of which have been lost to history. And for them, profound change was very late in coming. It took until the 1960s and 70s for the Québécois, the Acadiens in the Maritime provinces, and the Cajuns in Louisiana, each in their own way, to begin a call for respect. There were rebellions in some areas and some violence, but little. The people were determined to reclaim their dignity and their pride, and this they have done. Purifier nos cœurs. Purify our hearts. And this meant purify our hearts with great space, in which we expect nothing, in which our awareness is the awareness of the great darkness, nothing but darkness. We Canucks prayed for this. We prayed to be ghosts. This from a Franco-American Columbia University professor's memoir. This is only one example of what happens to a people who are subjected to repressive systems over many, many years. I'd like to share with you an example of something many of you may remember. Here's how the Québécois forced change. Do you remember reading about the Separatist Party in the 60s and 70s? Well, instead of mounting a violent revolution, they went after Canada's economic system by threatening to break away from the mother country. Although they never won enough votes and the separation didn't happen, they got heard, and things changed. The Québécois freed themselves from the self-perception that New Englander David Plante refers to in this memoir. Very important. It is this. History shapes cultures. It shapes people. It shapes who we become. The story is essential to finding out why we are who we are. For me, reading and study were only the very beginning of an intense personal journey. My work confirmed that what I had experienced as a child was real. My suffering was real. But I also discovered that under the pain was a hidden story. Here it is. The Acadiens and Canadiens were not descended from a weak people. But over centuries, and due to our distinct history, first in France and then in the Americas, they had developed a sense of powerlessness in the face of powerful outside forces, forces of both church and state that had exerted their dominion over them for centuries, telling them who to be, what to think, and what to do. This cannot be downplayed. As a result, some of our people became fatalistic, pliable, and not prone to question authority. They set limited goals, if at all. This isn't who they really were. Their true character became lost to them. It is for them that I tell this story. I long for the day when shame is no longer a part of the legacy of Franco-Americans in New England. Now I'm going to pause here and acknowledge that not all Franco-Americans in New England had the same experiences. At the same time, I feel it is necessary to address this very painful topic. Yet while some cities and towns in New England boast voter lists with a majority of French surnames, Franco-Americans go almost unnoticed. So we conclude with one final point. Why are the Franco-Americans such a silent presence here in New England? There's no simple answer to the question. For one thing, visiting France over the last few years, I've come to understand that as a culture, the French people, are naturally private people. They're not extroverted. Thus, part of the silence of the French in New England may be attributable to our nature. But I believe there's more to this than a natural tendency toward reticence. Silence can be reflective of many complex issues. It can mirror the inability to articulate deeply held feelings. It's often associated with pain and shame. Sometimes it's the only way to deal with pain. Perhaps this is what happened to our people. Under duress, their soul stepped aside and their spirit went into hiding. None of this is easy to speak about. Talking about pain and shame doesn't mean our people didn't do it right. Today, in this talk, we've learned that over the centuries, there were historical events which kept our people down. And there's nothing we can do to change this. In fact, some people might say, well, why bother with the past? Well, there is a new science called epigenetics that's teaching us that we all inherit cultural traits. Now, this science also makes it clear that we don't have to stay stuck in old inner narratives. And I was glad to read that. As I've noted, the story is not an easy one to tell. Yet I have personally experienced the importance of knowing the origin story. This has changed me. The shame that once framed my life has been transformed into quiet pride. I believe that by sharing this tale, I am honoring my ancestors. I am giving a voice to the voiceless. Thank you very much for being here. I'm open to questions. I think Jen is going to lead that. And if you're interested, this is information about my book if you would like to buy it. It's a little bit more detail on the story. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, John. That was really interesting. I learned so much. Even my own history is in there somewhere on my mom's side. I had a quick question while we're waiting. Certainly, folks can put their questions in the chat. But I had a quick one. Do you think this is changing? This silence is changing among younger generations? Have you seen any kind of shift?
I am starting to see some shift. There are more events happening throughout New England. It's really small right now. And I went to one in Leominster this past June. And I was shocked how many people had shown up, and everybody seemed so happy to be there. That made me feel so good. I'm telling this story because I think it's important to understand the past, but I'm also very thrilled that there seems to be a beginning of an interest in our culture.
Cynthia is asking, well, first of all, she's saying thank you, but she's wondering why, always wondered why Ken Burns never did a segment on the French discovery of America.
Oh, I guess I'll have to contact him.
Yep, somebody's got to reach out.
I think so.
Anyone
Thank you
else
very
have
much,
any?
Cynthia. I never thought of that.
Anyone else please feel free to put a question in the chat. If you're more comfortable, unmute yourself. You can certainly ask a question that way. That's fine as well. Anyone? Any questions?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes, I do,
go ahead,
Marcia.
Marcia.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, just a little background. My father's, I'm a Lavoie, and my father's father was born in this country, Southbridge, Mass. And I believe his parents had come from Canada. So anyway, my grandfather grew up, speaking French, and even though he obviously had to learn English, especially when he was orphaned at a young age and then sent to live with an older sister in New Hampshire, um, he did learn English, but always spoke with a French accent. But
Mhm.
anyway, um, and then my father, the next generation, he and his siblings did not speak French.
No surprise.
I know. And my mother, who came from an English and Lithuanian background, my mother used to do his French homework for him in college. But anyway, the thing I was just going to comment on, which I guess I had not put this in the sort of cultural perspective, but the whole idea of the sort of silence and the sort of privacy aspect of things. Because I realized that, there was always this thing in the family about, no, you don't talk about these things. You
Mhm.
don't talk about these outside the family. There was this big division between this is the family and those are outsiders, and you don't share those things. And I find that even I'm 71, the oldest of five siblings, and even among my sibling group, there's still this sort of conflict. Some of us who would like to be more open, and others who are still like, oh no, you can't say something like that. You can't let other people know, things that are going on in the family. So that those struggles continue with that intense sense of privacy and that division between the family and those who are outside the family. So I just thank you for helping me put this in this cultural perspective.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Anyone else have a question or comment? Again, feel free to unmute yourself. I thought we had a question there. We have quiet group today. Anybody else? Oh,
It's
we
an
have.
awful lot of material.
I do have a question from Lynn. She
Okay.
says, thank you for this background. Over the years, since about 1993, in researching folk life in Connecticut, I've been happy to have attended many Franco and French Canadian cultural events here. In the mid 90s, there was a big project called Franco Fest with music, food, and the French Genealogical Society talks. There have been many wonderful musicians we've worked with and recorded. Um, I, I'm not, my French is horrible. Rosalie Lahu, Daniel Boucher and his family, and Jose Vacon.
Mhm.
We're putting some of these recordings online. Lynn, I almost put you on the spot, so I'm glad you shared this information. Yes, there's a lot going on, and we uh, are putting some of these things on Connecticut Digital Archive, CTDA. So that's certainly a place to find things. Susie, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Um, I'm trying.
And we
Can
can
you?
hear you.
I can
Oh,
hear
okay.
you.
Yep.
Okay. I have a question of going through your very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I really lots of information there. Okay. So, I want to know, I have a little bit of a different take. There was a group of people that came into Quebec in the 1600s. came straight to Quebec, like my family did, 1647, Jacques Goulet. And eventually, my family does start to come down into down into the United States. But we don't think of ourselves as, how shall I say this? We don't think of ourselves in quite the same psychological state as you described those that came as a result of this mix of the kind of the two French cultures. My dad came in 1927, and before him, my grandfather came and worked in the mills in Massachusetts, in the furniture factories. And my dad came to work in the White Mountains in New Hampshire in 1927 with his brother. And so I don't think of myself as like having this idea of not really fitting into New England. And I guess I'm rambling here. Sorry for that. But
No,
is there another French group in New England that doesn't quite feel the same as the group that you described that came through these terrible, up and down and whatever have you? And that's not to say that we didn't do some back and forth with the British, because I found that I've had actually people that I could qualify for Daughters of the American Revolution, which I was astounded to hear that, because some of my French in Quebec fought against the British, and a couple of the grandsons of Jacques Coulet came down into the States and fought down in the Americas, but then went back to Canada. So I guess what I'm saying is, isn't there this other group of French? And I totally experienced everything from the 60s with the separationists, because it was like the American Civil War. Somebody flew a Quebec flag, somebody flew the maple leaf, and somebody flew both. And you knew right away when you stepped over that frontier, that border, who was siding with whom. But we had a different experience.
so thank you for sharing that. I want to make sure that everyone noted that I said this at the end of the one of the pieces, because we cannot make generalizations about anyone or any family. So what I'm going to say is this, in response to some of the things you have mentioned. There were not two groups who came to the Americas. All these people who came from France in the 1600s to the Americas came from very similar regions. You can't say the Acadiens came from one section and the Canadiens came from another. They came from all areas. And the point I was trying to make was that each group had a completely unique experience in the Americas because of the history. And segments of these Acadiens in the Maritime provinces and the Canadiens in Quebec came to the United States for varied reasons, a lot of them because of severe poverty. But they were also a repressed people. It may be that some families just didn't feel that, or where they lived, they had a different experience in their village or their town. So I'm not telling the story to imply that every single Franco-American in New England had the same story. What I discovered was that I found a lot of commonality when I started speaking with people and realized that there are a good number of people in this region still that carry this story in themselves and they don't realize it. And I want to let them know there's hope, because when you know the story, you can't condemn people. When you understand what they went through, you can only think of them with tremendous pride that they survived and we're here. So I hope that helps to clarify a few things. Let me just say one final thing. Most people, if they call themselves Franco-American, have roots in Quebec or Acadie, because so many people came down from the north. There are some people with a French name who came from France directly, but the great majority of Franco-Americans are of a northern extraction. And also, they didn't come beyond the 1600s. There really wasn't much immigration. As soon as the British won, the battle on the Plains of Abraham, there was no more immigration from France.
Jean, I just want to mention that Lynn did put a link to the vast collection that we have started, more to come on this topic on Connecticut Digital Archive. I will send that link to everyone when I send the video recording, which I tend to do a few days to a week afterwards. Brenda and Bob are commenting on we can compare and contrast the experience of the Italian and Polish diasporas to that of the Franco-Canadians. I'm sure we could even throw Irish in there. There's probably a lot of parallels. Unfortunately, we don't have time to dive into that. That would have been a very interesting conversation. Another person has mentioned they tried to meet you in Massachusetts while they were playing the fiddle there, and this person was curious, do you know why migrations to England have decreased? There's many French clubs that are no more just due to the decrease in numbers.
Oh, yeah, that's happening all over the place. There are a couple of things too. I don't want to forget. Let me just mention that I have a list of I have a list of resources for anybody who's interested. And Jen, I'm sorry I forgot to think about that, but I will send it to you.
Okay.
And if anybody would like it, on one side, I have a list of many books that are related to this topic. On the other side, I have a list of a ton of French groups who are playing up in Canada at this point, in Quebec. I do remember, I know José Vachon personally, and I've met other people who have played music. I'm sorry that I don't have information from them. Jose, I do, because she's got a lot out there. I just want to share the information that I have. So I'll send it to you, and please let Jen know if you're interested in receiving, because it can be sent by email, or if you want, use my email address and send me a heads up that you'd like a copy of this document.
John, if you want, you can send it to me and I can send it along when I send the other link.
Okay.
That way.
Great.
And then this Kelly, she's just mentioning that she really enjoyed the talk. Her family wound up in Lewiston, Maine, and she does recall her mother speaks of similar experiences.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I just want to say one final thing. I remember a friend of mine who's Jewish came up to me after my talk here where I live in Massachusetts, and he said, "You helped me understand things about my own culture." And that was the most exciting thing for me, because this is not a story only of the French in New England. This is a story of all peoples who have moved from place to place. This is our American story. This is our world story. We need to know it.
Right. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Jeanne, for sharing with us. I'm going to stop sharing your screen, and I just wanted to quickly mention, I know we're running low on time here, but we do have a few upcoming events that I wanted to mention. We do have a program that's part of a series that we've been doing for our 200th birthday. It's called Made to Last. And on Thursday, we'll be looking at textiles. And we do have a Connecticut weaver coming to talk about modern fiber arts, but going to look at some items in our collection to talk about how techniques have evolved. And then our next Lunch and Learn is on October 7th. We will have a talk by Mackenzie Torr. She's a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee, and she'll talk about how Black activists use the Temperance movement as a powerful vehicle for social change. And then we have a series, Common Ground, Growers of Color. This is a talk back. And so we're bringing together traditional artists and cultural practitioners rooted in different cultural traditions to demonstrate their work. And this is based on the artists featured in our Growers of Color video series. And so we will talk about the intersection of agriculture, culture, and community. And there's various speakers that will be at that event talking and telling us a little bit about that. But of course, as you all know, you can find all of this information about what is going on at the museum at connecticutmuseum.org. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, John, for telling us your personal story and putting it into context for us. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Have a great rest of your Tuesday. Thank you all.